Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with you today. I join you from Wurundjeri land, land that was never ceded. I pay my respects to First Nations, elders past and present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us here today. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to join you in person today, but I'm so thrilled to be able to join you virtually. Firstly, congratulations to everyone who submitted their work to the competition and the winners in advance. I can't wait to see what you've produced with your creative and intelligent minds. My appreciation for the work you do comes from what you might call an outsider perspective. I'm not an architect nor a planner. I'm a social worker by trade and a politician now by profession. Now, these vocations might seem to you not to be connected in many ways, but I want to share with you how I think they are and how those connections can help inform the theme that you've all worked with this competition. Those themes exploring the evolution of personal and community identity and how architecture can be shaped and indeed shape our identities and cultures that we live in and work in. To me, culture is an expression of our collective identities. Embarking on a career as a social worker, I didn't envisage that one day I would know so much about the impact of good design on our communities, nor become such a champion of your profession, but here I am. And this appreciation began before I even realized at a very early age. It shaped who I am today. I haven't always lived in Australia. I'm a migrant to this country, having grown up in Sri Lanka and migrating to Canada before we arrived in Australia. Sri Lanka is a developing country that has had a long history of war and conflict, and is the reason my family left. But before then, we had the joy of living within our own culture. As you can imagine, in the circumstances that the country was in, there wasn't a lot of resource for infrastructure or the built environment. As a result of little, if any, planning guidelines, the cities were congested, open space was scarce, and the environment was polluted. As a child, this had a big impact on the spaces we lived in. We ended up spending more time within our home, as backyards and parks were just not an option. Our journeys to and from school were a battle on congested roads, no matter whether you were travelling on foot, bike, car or bus. And if this is all you know, it becomes the norm. You adjust your expectations and outlook, but it still has an impact that I didn't quite realise until much later in life. At the age of 10, our family did our first migration to Toronto, Canada. Honestly, as a kid, it felt like we'd arrived in Wonderland. The air was clean, the streets weren't filled with honking horns or car pollution. There was grass and places to play on outside our apartment home. The streets were accessible with footpaths and pedestrian crossings that meant my sister and I were allowed to walk to and from school, which wasn't far away. It meant we got to know our physical community and formed a community of friends who trod the same path to and from school each day. The journey became the highlight of the day, full of stories and chatter, rather than congestion and stress. There was a library and swimming pool within walking distance from our home that meant after school and on holidays there were fun, healthy places to hang out in, places in which we formed friendships and connection and allowed us to learn and be physically active. You see why we felt like it was Wonderland. And mind you, as newly arrived migrants, we had little, so we didn't live in big fancy houses, but modest apartments. But apartments that had been built to house families and not just built to be transition boxes. Little did I realise, but as a 10-year-old, I was learning and experiencing about how our cities are built and how they function and how they can change your lives. We moved soon thereafter to Melbourne to be closer to family, and much of the wonder we experienced in Canada remained. But I did notice one big difference, that our suburbs seemed to work a bit differently here, and the one thing I noticed was the impact of distance. The suburb we moved to wasn't very wealthy. We rented a house on a semi-busy street, and it was a long way to get to school. We rode our bikes on the footpath each day because there were no safe bike paths and dodged pedestrians and inevitably had accidents along the way. The library and pools were also far away. It meant that after-school activities became less of an option. With busy working parents, as kids we started to retreat again. Without safe and accessible pathways, without local services that were close by, a child's world can contract a lot. Once again to the confines of the walls of their home, and if they're lucky, to their backyards. I tell you this story because it fundamentally shaped my identity. Not having much access to the natural world previously, having access opened my eyes to how much it impacted my well-being. Fast forward 15 years, and I was now a social worker working in many outer suburban areas of Melbourne. I saw the impact of the built environment, how it had an impact on the clients I worked with. And this was brought home to me even more strongly when I became a councillor at the City of Moreland. I came to understand that how our homes, neighbourhoods and cities are designed, planned and built can change our lives, our relationship with the environment and the future of the next generation. I saw this time and time again when, as a councillor, I sat on the committee that approved urban planning applications. In an area that was experiencing densification, we were receiving application after application for apartment buildings that proposed dwellings that had barely enough space to live in, very little natural light, and could not cater for anyone with a family that needed multiple rooms. These buildings also took their building envelope to the edge of the land boundary, with no space for green open space, and very imposing on the street below. We knew this would be compounded by the ability of developers to offset their requirement to provide open space, and also by council not being able to afford to buy land that was close by to provide parkland for the people who lived in those buildings eventually. We could see the reality before our eyes about how bad neighbourhood planning happens. It happens through 1,000 cuts. In this case, 1,000 bad quality planning applications compounded by weak or non-existent planning laws that it could actually ensure our neighbourhoods could be sustainable for the people who live in it and the environment that sustains it. There seemed to be little regard to the culture or character of a place, or the desire to help shape the identity or reflect the identity of a community seemed nowhere to be found in our planning and design frameworks. But there were exceptions. And I wanted to talk to you about how something new, something courageous, and something innovative can change the way a whole city works. I can't tell you how much these new and innovative applications, the applications that actually have thought and consideration and design behind them, started to change the way we as a council started to see how our neighbourhoods could actually work. And the people behind those visionary applications, people like you, who care about what long-lasting impact their work would have on our people and planet, started to shape our neighbourhood. They were the architects and designers like you who had thought about how the building they were planning interacted with a neighbourhood that embraced it and how the natural environment could be sustained. Being in Moreland, I was lucky to witness and be part of the visionary Nightingale projects. This began as one building planning application for the Commons that had a concept about community and sustainability embedded within it. You might be familiar with this project, but these were apartments to be built to the highest environmental sustainability with consideration about how the streets below interacted with the people who lived in the building. As a councillor, I learned about passive surveillance and how a street wall can have a big impact on community safety. These were car-free developments, the first of their kind and groundbreaking in their vision and their design. The next project in the series was for the first Nightingale projects that were built on the concept of the Commons, of fossil fuel and car-free developments that put a cap on profit to actually tackle the issue of housing affordability. Fast forward 5+ years later on, we now have a whole Nightingale precinct being constructed with more than 7 buildings in the Anstey neighbourhood of Brunswick. And why this is so significant is because of the location of the project. Prior to this project, this area was commonly regarded as an emerging concrete jungle. There were a litany of poor quality apartment buildings being built that separated people from each other through high concrete walls with little or no open green space. But the Nightingale vision started to change all of that. It's now on its way to making the Anstey precinct the most sustainable neighbourhood, dare I say it, anywhere in Victoria. My hope is that one day it will become the first car-free precinct in all of Australia. And this wasn't just about one project. What we started to see was council realising the potential for future design, planning and development in the area. It started to see this type of project as a new benchmark, and we soon started to have developer after developer putting on their Nightingale-type credentials to try and get council support for their project. We started to see a domino effect of better design being applied for at council, and indeed it is starting to shape the whole city for the better. And remember, this transformation began with one idea, one proposal, one building and one big vision, much like I'm sure we will see through the work you've submitted for the competition today. So my message and appeal to all of you is to never give up on your vision. Vision is what's transformative. You may at times feel like you're coming up against barriers or others may not support your views, but if you're passionate about what you hope to achieve, you will build allies and supporters, and you will create change. The work you're doing has the power to shape and change the lives and future sustainability of our environment and climate. Growing up in different neighborhoods myself, some that alienated people from each other and the environment, contrasted with places that built into their design how the built environment will impact people, I know firsthand how this can change your life. Being able to access a natural environment after not being able to made me value it even more deeply. It's the reason why I started to commit my life and work to protecting our natural environment and climate and becoming a passionate advocate for both. It shaped who I am today. So I ask you, in the work you do from now onwards, in your career before you, I ask you to consider a number of key questions before you embark on any project. Will it create places for people to meet and connect? Will it afford people places to cherish and nurture the natural environment? Will it encourage more sustainable living and help people change their consumption and travel? Will your work help tackle the climate crisis we're facing? Will it do everything it can to avoid the use of fossil fuels and reduce energy consumption and use natural light and ventilation? Will your project think about the community and culture that once inhabited a place? Will it reflect our First Nations, whose culture and lives are barely reflected in any of our urban environments now? To name a street or building respecting our First Nations heritage is still very sadly very rare, but must be something we work towards, let alone the work we have to preserve the cultural heritage of our First Nations that is being destroyed at a whim by developers and corporations. If you make it your intention to commit to design with community, culture and environment at the forefront, you can shape a neighborhood, a community and indeed a country in ways that you might not have imagined. I encourage you to do so because you are the visionaries that can shape the next generation. You can shape the identity of a generation. I wish you all the very best as you embark on this mission. Thanks again for having me today.